Howdy guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Ben, and this is another video in my Affinity Photo Foundation series where I go over some of the basic concepts used to edit photos in Affinity Photo. This series is great if you are new to Affinity Photo or just new to photo editing software in general. So in this video, we're going to be looking at making selections. So first I want to talk about what a selection is, why you'd want to make one, and the different tools you can use to make selections. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so first, what is a selection? Well, it sounds exactly like what it is. It's selecting a certain part of the image so you can make changes only to that part of the image. Some of the ways making selections can be useful is they can be used to limit the area you want to edit, paint in, or make adjustments. So let's say, for example, I have this image here, and here I have just her pants selected. So on a new layer, I could grab a paintbrush with a red color, and I can start painting in her pants to change the color to red. And because I have just her pants selected, it's only allowing me to paint within that selection. I could even change the color, and maybe I could make this part of them blue, and maybe even paint over this part to make it blue. You could do all kind of interesting things like that because my painting is being isolated to just the selected area. They can also be used to make easy copies. Let's say, for example, I have this image here. Now I'm going to go ahead and load up a selection I've already made of the model. And with her selected, I can go over to Layer and Duplicate Selection. And that's going to create a new pixel layer with her cut out. So if I go ahead and deselect this and I grab my Move tool, I can now grab that copy I made of her, and now I have two. And then if I wanted, I can readjust the size if I wanted to kind of make a clone type effect or something like that. So inversely, when you have something selected, it's very easy to delete it because I can just go ahead and press delete on my keyboard, and it's going to remove all those pixels that is within that selection. So this is different than actually removing her from the background. This is just a way that you can delete or remove certain areas of your image that you may not need. Let's go ahead and undo that. And one of the other things you can do with selections, which I use quite frequently, is using them to create masks for adjustment layers or even masks in general. So if you've watched my other video on masks and layers, you'll probably have a better understanding of what I'm doing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load up a selection I made of the background. And so currently I have just the background selected. And if I were to go over to, say, a black and white adjustment layer, when I create that black and white adjustment layer, let's go ahead and do a few tweaks here. Because I had that area selected, what it did is it went ahead and created a mask of that selection. So basically everything that is white, the effect is being revealed, and everything that is black, the effect is being hidden from us. So if I go ahead and deselect this effect, you can see our black and white effect is just affecting the background and not affecting her. So these are a bunch of different ways that you can use selections in your workflow, and Affinity Photo has a variety of tools to help you make these kind of selections, and we're going to go over those right now. But I want to go ahead and start with the Freehand selection tool, which looks like this little lasso here. And if you click on this triangle, you'll be presented with some other selection tools that are available. There is also things like the flood selection tool and the selection brush tool, which we will talk about later. But the freehand selection tool has the most options available, and most of these options are shared across some of the other tools. So I'm going to start with this to explain a lot of the main types and modes. Okay, so with that freehand selection tool selected, let's zoom in a little bit here. So let's just say I want to grab her and the umbrella. I'm going to go ahead and start at the top somewhere. Click down on my mouse, and holding the button down, I'm just going to freehand around this umbrella. Now I'm not going to try to make everything too precise. I'll show you some other ways that we can get more precise selections. I just want to show you roughly how making selections work. And we're going to go back to the beginning. And when I release it, we are going to now have our selection. And you'll know you have a selection by seeing these dotted moving lines, often called marching ants. And this shows us that this is the area that we have selected. If you move your mouse over the selection, you can click and you can drag and you can move your selection around in case you need to reposition it. And if you need to deselect, maybe you selected the wrong thing, you can go to select and click deselect, and that will deselect your layer so you can make a brand new selection if you need to. Another thing you can do is if you find those marching ants distracting, so let me go ahead and just do a really quick selection here. If you find these marching ants distracting, you can hide them by going over to View, and you can uncheck Show Pixel Selection. And even though those marching ants are gone, your selection is still there, and we can prove that by grabbing a paintbrush and just painting in, and you'll see that I can only paint in where that selection is. I will say you should be careful about remembering what you have selected, because it's very easy to forget that you have a selection selected when it's being hidden from you. So try to make sure to have your show pixel selection turned on. I've definitely made this mistake where I just couldn't figure out why something wasn't working, and that was because I had hidden a pixel selection that I forgot to turn back on. So let me go ahead and deselect this selection here. And I'm going to show you one more thing. So let's go back to our freehand tool. And you don't always have to go back to the beginning of your, or at least your start point. If I release my mouse here, it's just going to draw a straight line from my previous point to the beginning of the selection. Then I have my new selection here. And one more very convenient thing is you also have the ability to save selections. This time I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut to deselect, which is Command D on a Mac. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit Command D, and that is going to deselect my selection. And let's just do a really rough freehand selection of her umbrella and just under her arm, around the handle, and something like that. Now let's say we want to save this selection because we might use it later. We can save selections by going over to Select and Save Selection. And you're presented with two options, as a spare channel or to a file. To a file is what it sounds like. Affinity Photo will create a separate file somewhere on your computer where you specify, and then you can load that file with the load selection from file. But I think if you're working all in the same image, saving it as a spare channel is a little bit faster. So if I go ahead and click Save as Spare Channel, and we open up our Channels panel. Now, if you don't have your Channels panel or you can't find it, you can go to Window and make sure the Channels panel is checked, and it should come up and it should look something like this. My desktop has been a little bit customized to my preference, so yours might be in a different location. But once you find it, you'll see at the bottom, we now have something called Spare Channel. And if we click on it, it'll show us what that spare channel looks like. And it kind of looks like a mask. So if you've watched my last video on masks, you know that with a mask, the black area is kind of being hidden from us and the white area is what's being revealed to us. Or in this case, the white area is our selection. We also have the ability to rename selections. So you could rename it to something like umbrella. That way you could load it up later when you need to by right-clicking on it and saying load to pixel selection, or add, subtract, or intersect, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and delete this spare channel. Let's click on the layer to bring our picture back, and let's go ahead and hit Command D to deselect that. Okay, so now let's look at the different types that we have here. So at the top, we have freehand, polygonal, and magnetic. So polygonal works a little bit differently. Let's go ahead and try that one out. If we want to select the same area as before, I'm going to go ahead and start at the top of the umbrella, but this time I'm just going to click the mouse down once. And then as I move my cursor around, you're going to see that the selection line follows my cursor. So I go to my next point and I click again. And this is a really great tool, especially if you're doing kind of architectural type work, or you're trying to select buildings or walls or kind of straight edge things from the background. But of course, you can get as precise as you want. If I zoom in a little bit here, I can kind of make a bit of this arm shape like so. And if at any point you kind of make a mistake like that, you can go ahead and press the delete key and it will delete your previous point, and you can go back to where you felt you had a good selection, and you could continue around and make this selection as precise as you want. So as you can see, this is going to give you a little bit more control to make a more precise selection. And then if you want, you can go back to the beginning to close it, or you can just hit return on your keyboard and it will close a selection from its last point. And now we have a bit more of a precise selection that we could apply effects to, make copies of, etc. So let's go ahead and deselect that. And let's look at the magnetic one. So the magnetic one works a little bit differently. This time we are going to, let's zoom in a little bit more. This time we're going to make one click like before, but this time we don't have to click anymore. As we move our cursor, you're going to see that Affinity Photo is kind of snapping or magnetizing itself to its perceived edge, or what it sees as an edge. So even if you go a little bit off, you can still come back and hit delete to remove those points. But for the most part, it will do a pretty good job of sticking to an edge. Now, there might be instances where it has a hard time finding what you want. So for example, if I want to grab this strap here, I may have to create my own point by just clicking down on the mouse. And this way I create my own points so I can get a bit more precise and then let Affinity Photo do most of the other work. There you can see it when I put arm too high. So I might have to go a little bit slower to give Affinity Photo time to kind of figure out where the edge is. And you get the idea. We go back all the way around. I'm not going to really bother making it look perfect here, but we can snap here because it seems like it's having a hard time with that black thing in the background. And we can go back to our beginning point. And now we have probably a bit more precise selection here. So those are the three different types when you're working in the freehand selection mode. The other tools do not have that mode. If you go to rectangle or row and column, they don't have those modes available. So that's why I wanted to show it to you in the freehand selection tool, because this has the most options. Okay, let's go ahead and deselect this. Let's go back to our freehand tool and let's now talk about the modes. So we have 4 modes. By default, most of them will be set to new, which means if you make a selection and then you go to make another selection, it's going to erase the previous selection and it's always going to create a new selection. But let's say, for example, that we wanted to select these arches in the background. So if I were to go ahead and select this arch here, just doing a very rough outline, and I wanted to do the other one, well, if I do that, it's going to erase the previous arch. So what we can do is we can change our mode from new to add. And this is going to add to our selection. You're going to notice that we now have a little plus sign next to our cursor. And that means that when we draw another selection, it adds it to our selection so we can continue to make as many selections as we like. They will also intersect. Let's say, for example, I wanted them to be connected at the bottom. I can come over here. And as you can see now, these selections are connected. So the other mode is subtract, and that sounds exactly like what it does. If I want to remove that part, you're going to see my cursor now has a minus sign next to it. And I can come over here and basically say, I don't want that, and it will remove it from the selection. Like so. And also, while you are in the new mode, let's go ahead and deselect this here. You can use kind of modifier keys to change your mode without having to actually click up here at the top. So if I were to make this selection like before, and if I want to add to my selection, I can press Control on my Mac, and that will present a plus sign, or if I press Option, it will present a minus sign. So by holding down Control on my keyboard, I can go into basically add mode. And if I hold down Option, I can go into subtract mode. So that is very useful and does definitely speed up your workflow a bit. Now the last mode is intersect. And personally, this is something I've never really used, but I'm sure there are use cases for it. And basically, it's going to only select the areas that intersect with other sections. So if I do this here, you're going to see the only area that was selected was where it intersected. So personally, I never really have use for this type of selection mode, but I'm sure there are people who can find it very useful. Okay, let's go ahead and deselect all of this. Now, 2 other options you're going to see up here is feather and anti-alias. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. And let's just go ahead and make a very simple circle. Oops, I'm still in intersect mode. Let's go back to new mode. Just go ahead and make a little circle here. And then what I want to do is, just as for demonstration purposes, I'm going to make a brand new layer. I'm going to grab a paintbrush and we'll just go ahead and grab a red color. I'm going to paint inside that circle. And so this is with the feather was set to 0. Okay, let's go ahead and deselect this. Let's make a new selection, but this time let's bring our feather up to like, I don't know, 50. Let's go ahead and do our selection here. And let's go back to our paintbrush and now paint with our red. And as you can see that because we've feathered the effect, the selection is kind of being gradually feathered out. And you can see that by the way that it's going outside of the marching ants or our selection line. And so the more that you feather something, the more kind of fuzzier and soft your edge is going to be. Let's go ahead and show you one more example. Let's go back to our freehand selection tool. I'm going to deselect this and let's look at what anti-aliasing does. I'm going to go ahead and turn anti-aliasing off. And I'm going to just draw a really small circle here. Go back to my paintbrush. Let's actually bring our feather down. Now, one thing you have to be aware of is that when you're changing options, if I do this here and I lower the feather now after I've made that selection, it doesn't change it because we've already created our selection. So what I'd have to do then is go back to my thing and make sure you have your feather set to 0 before you draw your selection. Then you will be sure that you have 0 feather. Okay, so in this example, we had anti-aliasing turned off. So let's go ahead and do another example with anti-aliasing turned on. And we're going to draw it right next to it here. Let's go back to our paintbrush and let's paint and let's deselect and let's zoom in here so we can see what we're looking at. Okay, so on the left, we have anti-aliasing turned off. And you can see it has very jagged edges. There is red pixels and then the next pixel next to it is just nothing. It's the background. Where when you have anti-aliasing turned on, you can see, let me go ahead and turn off my show pixel grid. You can see that it tries to blend into the background a little bit better, thus giving you a more softer looking edge, especially at this distance. You can see that the one on the right looks a little bit softer because anti-aliasing is on, and the one on the left is a lot harder because anti-aliasing is off. For doing photo type editing work, more than likely you're always going to want to have anti-aliasing on, and maybe a little bit of feather might help. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this layer here, and let me just quickly run through the other tools and show you how they work. So first off, rectangular marquee tool, very simple. It creates rectangles or squares. If you want to guarantee you have a square proportion, you can hold down Shift on your keyboard, and that way you will always get a square selection. Same goes for the elliptical marquee tool. You can make ellipses and circles, but if you want a perfect circle, hold down the Shift key on your keyboard, and now you will have a perfect circle. Now the two that also work a little bit different is going to be the column and row marquee tool. So I'm going to go ahead and click the column marquee tool. And the way this one works is, let's go ahead and set our feather to 0, is you set the width first. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to 100 pixels or 50 pixels. And if I click down anywhere on the image, it's going to create a column 50 pixels wide. And actually I'm set to add mode, but let's go to new. Let's go ahead and bring this up to say 100. And you'll see here that it's going to create a column that is exactly 100 pixels wide. So again, this is something that I don't ever use too frequently, or basically never. And not because I don't think it's useful, it's just for the kind of work that I do. I can't find any use for it. I could see it maybe being used for some kind of effect. So if I change it to add mode, and I can just add a bunch of these 100 pixel width selections, then maybe with all that selected, I could add some kind of like recolor effect. And you know, let's go ahead and deselect so I can see what I'm doing here. And yeah, I could add some recolor effect if I wanted to create some kind of interesting effect. But for the kind of work that I do, I haven't found much use for that tool. And as you suspect, the row marquee tool works exactly the same, it just makes rows. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is at any point you can invert your selection to make broader selections a bit easier. So let's say, for example, I grab a elliptical marquee tool and I'll put a circle. I'm gonna hold down Shift to get a good circle here, reposition it. And let's say that I want to select everything outside of this circle. So right now the circle is selected. So if I were to add a black and white adjustment layer, you will see that I am affecting inside my selection. Let's go ahead and delete this. Now this time, let's go over to Select and Invert Pixel Selection. This is gonna select everything outside of that circle. So now if I apply that black and white adjustment layer, it's going to be affecting everything outside of that circle because now our selection is everything except that circle because we inverted it. And sometimes that's easier to kind of select the area that you want to exclude and then do a invert selection to apply an effect to everything else. So another tool we can look at is the Flood Select tool. And this works best when you have something that is a very solid color. So for example, let's go back to that image of that runner here. And if I go ahead and just click here on the blue background, what the Flood Selection tool does is it grabs colors that are very similar to the area that you selected. And as you can see here, it grabbed most of the blue background. It didn't grab all of it though, so you can play with the tolerance to try to make it expand a bit further. And you can try going a little bit higher. But if you start to go too far, it might start grabbing colors outside of that blue. You can see here it's grabbing the shoe. So this is not really a tool that I use too frequently just because some of the other tools do a better job, but it can be useful to make a really quick selection. For example, it might do a better job of trying to select her leggings. So if I go ahead and click here on her leggings, it's going to grab everything that's black in the image. That's because we have contiguous checked off. If I check contiguous on, it's only going to select similar colors that are touching. Now, right now, our tolerance might be too high because it's grabbing some of this darker area of her stomach. Let's go ahead and lower the tolerance down to 10%. Click again, and now we have a pretty good selection of her legs. And I could see use cases for doing something like, let's say I want to grab just the pink in her shoes. If I click on it here, now because we have contiguous checked on, it's only grabbing this one. If I were to check it off and click again, it's probably going to, again, try to grab a lot of that similar pink color. So you may have to really play around with the tolerance levels to get an exact selection. But to be honest, I feel like the next tool that we're going to look at is just going to do a lot better job at making these types of selections. And that brings us to the next tool, which is probably the one that I use the most and probably use for about 90% of my work. And that is going to be the Selection Brush tool. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Selection Brush tool here. And you'll notice we have a few similar options. Here we only have Add and Subtract, but we also have Snap to Edges and All Layers and Soft Edges. The most important being Snap to Edges, which kind of works like the magnetic freehand tool where it's going to find an edge and automatically snap to it. All Layers means that you don't actually have to be on that layer to create a selection. You could just be on a new layer and it'll still find edges. And Soft Edges kind of sounds like what it does. It just makes the edge a little bit more soft, similar to anti-aliasing. So this tool works like a brush. So let me go ahead and make my brush size a little bit bigger. And if I want to select her pants, I just come over here and start painting in, and you're going to see that it just kind of automatically snaps to her pants. Now, this selection is still here. Let me go ahead and delete that or deselect it so we can start from scratch. And just by kind of painting over her, the faster I move my mouse, the more it will select, and you can get very precise selections. So if I wanted to grab her top and her leggings, now you can see here it's very black. So what I can do is I can switch over to subtract mode and say, okay, don't grab that, and maybe switch back over to add mode and maybe make the brush a little bit smaller to try to get a bit more of a precise selection. And I can also use my modifier keys like holding down the Option key to go into subtract mode. And there I can get a pretty good selection of just her clothes, which then means I could create a new layer, grab a paintbrush, and with red or pink, And let's maybe change the blend mode to color. I could come over here and just make all of her clothes red or blue or any color I wanted. So I find the selection brush tool very handy and very useful, and it makes it very easy to get more precise selections. Now, one last thing that I want to talk about, which is also very, very important. Let's go ahead and go back to our selection brush tool, and let's go to this earlier image. So let's say I wanted to change the color of the umbrella just to add a bit more color contrast in this image. This is a great candidate for the selection brush tool. So with my selection brush tool selected, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and make the brush a little bit bigger. And I'm going to just start painting within the umbrella. And you're going to find that Affinity Photo does a pretty good job of kind of catching and finding the edges. Let's go all the way up to this white edge here. If it's not perfect right now, that's fine because we are going to be refining it in our next step. Now you see down here, it kind of grabbed part of her hand. I guess because her hand looks very similar in color to the umbrella. So we can go over to our subtract mode, or we could use our modifier key option and hold that down as we paint to kind of paint her hand out of our selection. And we could do the same thing on this little edge here where it kind of went off. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and go back to add. And there's a little part here that I want to fix. And then I just want to get rid of that. So it's just kind of right up against her hair. And I think that looks okay. Now we are going to move into the refining process. So most of the selection tools will have this refine button. And if we press refine, it's going to basically give us the ability to further refine our selection to get it more precise. Now, when you click this button, Affinity Photo will automatically do a slight refine, but here we have the option to refine it even further. So right off the bat, you're going to see the image becomes very red. This is just the overlay mode of looking at things. So everything that is red is not selected, and everything that is in color or the original color is what we have selected. If you find this view hard to look at, you can look at it a few different ways. So for example, if we change preview to black matte, it will make everything that's not a selection become black, and it becomes very easy to see certain parts that you have selected. You could do a white matte. I often like to look at it as black and white because it looks like a mask and it's very easy to see parts that have been missed. And you can also look at it as a transparency. Let's go ahead and take a look at it at the black and white mode. And if we zoom in here, you can see that it grabbed some of her fingers and her hand, which we don't want to do that. So what we can do is we can further refine our selection with some of these options here. So here we have 4 sliders and each one kind of does a different thing. So what border width does is it kind of expands the border of your selection either in or out. So if we go out to an extreme amount, you're going to see that it's going to start grabbing areas outside of your selection. Depending on what you're selecting, that might be useful. If we bring it into a 0 value, it's going to kind of tighten up that selection, which looks nice and clean, but you can see we lost some of that fine detail in her hair. Let's go ahead and bring it back to the default of I think 10%, and some of that hair detail has come back. Smooth is basically just going to round off any harsh edges. If we bring the smooth slider really, really high, you're going to see that it's just kind of rounding everything off, which might be useful for certain situations, but when you're doing something like this, it's not useful at all to me. Feather, just like we learned before, is just going to blur the edges and feather the edges of that selection. And then ramp is a little bit more complicated. Basically, some of these areas where you can see are kind of gray. We've got black, white, but we have lots of kind of gray values in between. By adjusting the ramp, you're going to basically take those gray or semi-transparent values and make them harsher in contrast. If I start bringing these up, you're going to see that white starts bleeding into the gray and we have these very defined white borders and we're kind of losing a bit of that smooth transition. If we go the other way, it kind of does the same thing, but it kind of expands the black out toward the edge. I personally don't use this one too much, so I'm going to go ahead and reset it back to its default, which is 0. And then we have our adjustment brushes, and these are very useful. So an adjustment brush is another way we can further refine our selection. So let me show you a good example of the first one, which is matte. So if I go ahead and look at my image in overlay mode, you can see she has these strands of hair that were missed was the initial selection, right? If I go ahead and look at it in black and white, you can see that hair is not selected and that hair down here is not selected. So with the matte brush, what you do is you use the matte brush and you just paint over an area. And basically Affinity Photo will take a second look at it, and depending on what you're painting and also the size of your brush, it will do a little bit of a better job of refining that edge. So now if I go ahead and look at black and white, you're going to see it did a little bit of a better job of kind of selecting that hair. You can always go over it a few times to see if it improves or gets a little bit better. But hair is something that is very complicated and complex, and there are plenty of videos about how to make good hair selections. So I'm not really going to get too detailed into it here. I'm just going to go ahead and use this matte brush to kind of go over some of these other little hair parts like so. Okay, so looking back at our black and white, we can see that we have some of this bleeding into her hand. So here's a good use for when you use the foreground or background brush. Let's go ahead and start with the background, which is going to be the black. And by painting in the black, we're basically telling Affinity Photo, hey, this is part of the background, don't select this. And Affinity Photo will do a pretty good job of finding that edge. And the other one is going to be, let's go ahead and get rid of this here. I guess this is her hand. And like I said, I look at it in black and white, but you can always go over to overlay and see what is what. But if I go back to black and white, I can switch to the foreground brush and maybe say, okay, let's make the brush a bit smaller and maybe tighten up this edge a little bit. But for the most part, that looks like it's going to be okay. You can see here the mask I want to actually grab here. So I'm going to use that foreground brush to do that. Maybe just grab it like this. And if you want to be really precise, you can get as precise as you like. But for now, this selection I think looks pretty good. And so now we have different options to output it. And I guess there's the feather option, which I didn't talk about, when all that really does is just kind of blur the edges as you would expect feather to do. So now we have output, where we can do output as a selection, a mask, a new layer, or a new layer with mask. Since we're talking about selections, let's go ahead and output it as a selection. We're going to hit apply again, zoom out. And now we should have a very precise selection of this umbrella. And since we have this selected, I'm going to go ahead and let's try an HSL adjustment layer. Click on that. And now using the hue shift, I can kind of shift these colors of the umbrella to maybe find something that's a bit more contrasty like this blue. I can also deselect this selection. That way those marching ants aren't bothering me. And I could mess around with the saturation or the luminosity to maybe find a color that I like. And there we have adjusted the umbrella. Now the cool thing that I may have mentioned before, when you have a selection and add an adjustment layer, it automatically creates a mask. So you can see this is our mask right here. And at any time, while you have a mask, you can right click on that mask and hit refine mask to go back into that refine menu if you need to make further adjustments. But what I like to do with the mask is paint it as a normal mask. And this is going to help me get super precise with my selections in a sense. So for example, we can see here it didn't fully grab this strap. It's still a little bit orange. So because we have a mask, and if you remember from my previous video about masks and layers, we can just paint on a mask with a black or white paintbrush to adjust that mask. So I'm going to go and switch to a paintbrush. Let's get one color white. I'm going to press X on my keyboard and make this color black. And I'm going to go ahead and paint with a white paintbrush. Let's make our brush a bit bigger. And here I can just paint in that strap. So if I paint, it's going to paint in that effect. If I switch back to a black, it's going to then hide that effect. So let's say, for example, that I wanted this middle stripe to be the original color. I could come in here and painting on the mask, or in Affinity Photo, when you have an adjustment layer with a mask built in, all you have to do is have the layer selected. And I could manually paint some of these colors out. And then if I didn't like that, I said, you know what, let's go back to white, and we can just paint that back in. This is also a really great way when you need to kind of refine the edge. So here you don't really see it too much, But let's say, for example, that the mask kind of went a bit too far and it was bleeding into her fingers. Well, it's an easy fix because we can go and grab a black paintbrush and just kind of manually get really precise with our mask or selection. Now, if you want to go back and reselect that, well, we've already deselected our selection. So what if we want to make further changes, maybe add some more effects on top of this? There's one little shortcut you can do. So if I press and hold Command on my keyboard, click on the mask, it's going to automatically select that mask. Then maybe to be safe, I might want to go to Select, Save Selection as a spare channel, and then I have it here so I could reload it into there at any time. And then once it's reloaded, let's say for example, I want to make it black and white. I can add a black and white adjustment layer and, kind of do any kind of adjustment I want to make there. Now there is another way you can also make selections, and I don't do this one too often because I'm not good at it, and that is using the pen tool. So let's see, where is my pen tool? My pen tool is here. So the pen tool is a great tool, especially if you're good at it, because you can make a really precise selection. So let's say for example, that I want to try to select her umbrella. You could use the pen tool and, you could try making really great selections. And once you've kind of made your selections using the pen tool, which again, I am not good at it, so I'm not going to do the whole thing. Let's just say, for example, I want to grab this. Okay. And here you can say we have the option to make it as a mask or a selection. We just click on selection, and now that pin outline that we made has now become a selection. And in this mode, you'll notice because we are in the pin mode, we don't have an option to refine it. We could refine it by just clicking on any one of these other selection tools, or you can go to select and refine edges, and that will bring up the refine selection tool that we used before. And you could further refine your selections here. So that is another way to make selections, especially useful if you are good using the pen tool. Personally, I'm not very good at it, but that option is there if you choose to use it. Okay, so that's going to be it for this video. There are other ways to make selections. If you go to the select menu, you're going to see you have ways to make a selection from color range, tonal range, alpha range, layer intensity. But that's just going to make the video a whole lot longer. So maybe one day in the future, I will make a video about those selection methods. But for me, I find these selection methods the most useful and easy to use. And they are very powerful, and they allow you to do all kind of really cool things within Affinity Photo. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too long. And thank you guys for watching. I think we're over 3,000 subscribers now, so that's pretty cool. And I guess until the next video, guys, I'll see you then. All right, later.